It's a bit strange putting my story out there, but I really want to know if I was wrong in how I handled things. So here it goes. My name's Mark, I'm 29, and this story goes back a few years. It involves an ex, a close friend, and a situation that I can't quite shake from my mind. Back then I was casually seeing someone named Julia. We weren't serious at all. I had made it clear from the start that I wasn't looking for a relationship, and she seemed fine with that. To be honest, we were both seeing other people, so it wasn't some great love affair. It lasted for about 3 months, and then we mutually ended things. Here's where it gets a little complicated. About a week after we stopped seeing each other, Julia started dating my friend Adam. Adam and I had been friends for a long time, and seeing them together felt a bit weird. I couldn't help but wonder if something had been going on between them while Julia and I were still involved. But I pushed the thought aside. After all, Julia and I weren't exclusive, and I didn't have feelings for her. If they were happy, who was I to hold a grudge? Over the years, Julia and Adam's relationship got serious. They eventually got married and had a child. From the outside, their life looked pretty perfect. I stayed friends with Adam and kept things polite with Julia whenever we crossed paths. It wasn't something I dwelled on. But everything changed when another friend of mine, Chris, came into the picture. He wasn't part of our immediate circle and had no ties to Adam, but he dropped a bombshell that turned all of this upside down. And that's where things started to spiral. Let me explain what happened next. When Julia and Adam started dating, I'll admit it caught me off guard. It wasn't jealousy. I didn't have those kinds of feelings for Julia, but it was strange to see someone I'd been casually involved with now so deeply connected to a close friend. I wondered how long this had been brewing. Had something started between them while she and I were still seeing each other? I thought about it briefly but decided it wasn't worth dwelling on. Julia and I were never serious, and it's not like Adam and I had some unspoken agreement about her. He was my friend, and if he was happy with her, I figured that was all that mattered. At first, things felt awkward. I'd see them together at gatherings, holding hands or laughing at inside jokes, and it was hard not to feel like an outsider in some moments. I wouldn't have called it resentment, but there was a lingering discomfort I couldn't entirely shake. Still, I made an effort to be supportive, even congratulating Adam when he first told me they were officially a couple. In time, the weirdness faded. They seemed genuinely happy, and I convinced myself that any doubts I had were just remnants of pride or misplaced ego. Life moved on. Adam remained one of my closest friends, and Julia became part of the group in a way that felt natural over the years. For a long time, everything seemed fine. I even started to admire their relationship, the stability they had, the way they navigated life together. I wouldn't say we were all inseparable, but we functioned well as a group of friends. Then Chris came back into the picture, and everything I thought I knew about Julia and Adam's perfect relationship began to unravel. As the years went by, Julia and Adam's relationship grew stronger, or so it seemed. They got married in a beautiful ceremony, surrounded by family and friends. I was there, of course, standing beside Adam as one of his groomsmen. Watching them exchange vows felt surreal. I never imagined that someone I had casually dated would become my best friend's wife, but by that point, it felt completely normal. Their life together seemed picture perfect. They bought a cozy house in the suburbs, and a couple of years later, they welcomed their son, Ethan. Adam was over the moon about becoming a dad, and I couldn't have been happier for him. Whenever we hung out, he'd show me photos of Ethan or share stories about the sleepless nights and diaper disasters. He embraced fatherhood in a way that made me proud to call him my friend. Julia, too, seemed to thrive in her role as a wife and mother. She was warm, attentive, and always made an effort to keep their family close-knit. To an outsider, their life looked ideal, almost like something out of a movie. I never questioned it. Our friendship dynamic shifted a little, as often happens when someone becomes a parent. Adam and Julia were busier. Their priorities changed, but we still found time to catch up. I'd stop by their house occasionally for dinner or drinks, and everything felt right. It never crossed my mind that there might be cracks in their seemingly solid foundation. I assumed they had what everyone wanted, a stable, loving marriage. But assumptions have a way of setting you up for surprises, and the surprise, when it came, hit me harder than I could have imagined. It started with a phone call from Chris. Chris wasn't someone who appeared in my life regularly. He lived in another city, and while we were good friends in the past, our interactions had become sporadic over the years. Still, whenever we reconnected, it felt like no time had passed. Chris was one of those people you could count on for a laugh, a wild story, or some outrageous gossip. But this time, the story he shared wasn't one I was ready to hear. We were catching up over the phone when Chris, in his usual blunt way, said, "You won't believe who I hooked up with." I chuckled, expecting him to drop the name of some random woman I wouldn't know. Instead, he said, "Julia." I froze. At first, I thought it must be a misunderstanding. "Julia who?" I asked, trying to keep my voice even. "Julia. You know, Adam's wife," he replied casually, as if he were talking about the weather. My stomach dropped. I asked him to explain, and he didn't hold back. Chris told me that he and Julia had been involved for a while. It started as a fling and quickly escalated into a short-lived romance. According to him, Julia ended things because she didn't want to disrupt her family. She had a son to think about, and as Chris put it, she chose stability over passion. He didn't seem the least bit guilty about it. In fact, he sounded almost proud, like he was bragging about his conquest. "If you want, you can tell Adam," he said nonchalantly. "It's not like I care." I was stunned. I didn't know how to respond. On one hand, I was furious at Chris for betraying Adam like that. On the other, I felt conflicted about what to do with this information. Did I have any right to get involved? I told Chris I needed time to process everything and ended the call. But the weight of what he'd told me didn't go away. It just kept growing. After hanging up with Chris, I couldn't stop replaying the conversation in my head. What was I supposed to do with this information? On one hand, Adam was my close friend, someone I cared deeply about. On the other hand, Julia and I had a history, however brief, and it complicated everything. I felt like I was holding a grenade, unsure whether to throw it or let it explode in my own hands. The idea of telling Adam felt wrong in so many ways. What right did I have to interfere in his marriage? And what if Chris was exaggerating or leaving out key details? Julia wasn't just Adam's wife. She was the mother of his child. Blowing up their marriage over something I didn't witness firsthand could have devastating consequences, especially for Ethan. But then I couldn't shake the feeling that staying silent made me complicit. If Adam found out later, and it came out that I'd known all along, what would that say about me as a friend? Wouldn't he have wanted to know the truth, even if it was painful? Chris's casual attitude toward the whole thing only made it worse. He'd practically dared me to spill the secret, like it was some kind of game to him. I hated the thought of being manipulated into doing his dirty work, but I also couldn't deny that what he'd shared weighed heavily on my conscience. For days, I wrestled with the decision. Every time I saw Adam's name pop up in my messages, I felt a pang of guilt. I avoided their house, worried that seeing Julia would make things even harder to navigate. The more I thought about it, the more the lines blurred between what was right and what was wrong. Eventually, I realized that avoiding the situation wasn't going to make it go away. Adam deserved the truth, or at least my version of it. The only question was how to tell him in a way that wouldn't destroy everything. So I decided to test the waters. It didn't feel right to just drop the bomb on Adam out of nowhere, so I tried to ease into it. The next time we met up, I brought up Chris casually, mentioning that I'd spoken to him recently. Adam laughed, rolling his eyes. "What's Chris been up to? Still chasing anything that moves?" he joked. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. This was it, the moment to say something. I kept it vague at first. "Yeah, same old Chris. He mentioned some complicated situations he's been in recently." Adam's face shifted slightly. He raised an eyebrow. "Complicated how?" I hesitated. My instinct was to backtrack, but I couldn't. "Let's just say he's been involved with people he shouldn't be." Adam stared at me, his expression sharpening. "You're being cryptic. Is this about someone I know?" There was no turning back now. I nodded, avoiding his eyes. "Yeah, actually, it's about Julia." The silence was immediate and heavy. Adam's face went blank, but I could see his mind racing. "What are you saying, Mark?" he asked quietly, his voice tight. I tried to tread carefully. Chris told me he and Julia had a thing. I don't know all the details, but it happened while you two were married. Adam's reaction was raw and immediate. He stood up, pacing back and forth, running his hands through his hair. "You're serious, Chris? With Julia?" His voice grew louder with each word. I explained everything I knew, emphasizing that I had no personal agenda and that I'd struggled with whether or not to tell him. Adam didn't seem to hear most of it. His focus was on Julia and the betrayal he felt. Before I could say much else, he grabbed his keys and stormed out. I didn't know where he was going, but I had a sinking feeling that the fallout from this conversation was just beginning. Adam didn't respond to any of my messages or calls for the rest of the day. I spent the evening replaying our conversation in my head, wondering if I'd made a mistake. By the next morning, I found out from a mutual friend that Adam had left the house after confronting Julia. He'd packed a bag and checked into a hotel. The confrontation between them must have been intense. I could only imagine how Julia reacted to Adam walking in, fueled by what I'd told him. Later, I learned that she denied everything at first, but eventually admitted to a brief involvement with Chris. That revelation was enough to shatter Adam's trust. The fallout extended beyond their marriage. Julia called me, furious, saying I'd crossed a line by meddling in their relationship. She accused me of stirring up trouble and ruining their family. Her voice shook with anger, and for a moment I questioned if she was right. Had I overstepped? At the same time, I couldn't ignore the guilt that had been weighing on me before I told Adam. He deserved to know the truth, even if it was messy and painful. Still, the damage was undeniable. Their home, once a picture of stability, had become the epicenter of chaos. For days, I avoided Adam, not knowing if he wanted to hear from me. When he finally reached out, he was drained but calm. He told me he'd decided to return home for Ethan's sake. They were trying to work things out, though it was clear the wounds were still fresh. The atmosphere between us was different after that. Adam seemed guarded, and Julia was distant whenever I saw her. The dynamic had shifted, and there was no going back to how things used to be. A week after the fallout, Adam moved back home. He told me he couldn't bear to stay away from Ethan for too long. "It's not about Julia," he clarified during a strained phone call. "It's about being there for my son. He needs me, no matter what's going on between us." I could hear the exhaustion in his voice, a mix of anger, hurt, and resignation. He didn't go into detail about how things were at home, but I could tell it wasn't easy. When I finally saw him in person, he looked like a shell of himself, tired, withdrawn, and weighed down by everything that had happened. Julia, for her part, seemed determined to repair the damage. From what I heard through Adam, she apologized repeatedly and insisted the affair with Chris was a mistake, something that would never happen again. Adam wasn't convinced, but he was trying to give her the benefit of the doubt, if only for the sake of keeping their family intact. Things between me and Julia, however, were far from normal. She avoided me at every turn. On the rare occasions we ended up in the same room, the tension was palpable. It wasn't just anger, it was something heavier, like unspoken blame hanging in the air. She made it clear she hadn't forgiven me for telling Adam. Surprisingly, Adam and I managed to maintain a semblance of our friendship, though it was different now. There was an unspoken understanding that we wouldn't talk about Julia or Chris unless he brought it up. Even then, he rarely did. He seemed to be compartmentalizing, trying to focus on his son and his own mental health, rather than dwelling on what couldn't be undone. I wondered if things would ever feel normal again, for them, for me, for all of us. But even as time passed, that question lingered in the back of my mind. In the weeks that followed, I couldn't stop second-guessing my decision to tell Adam. At first, I thought I'd done the right thing. He deserved to know the truth, didn't he? But seeing the fallout, the strain on his marriage, the tension in our friendship, and Julia's obvious resentment made me question everything. I started replaying the situation over and over in my head. What if I had handled it differently? What if I had kept it to myself, or confronted Julia directly instead of involving Adam? Would that have spared him the pain of knowing, or would it have just delayed the inevitable? Every time I thought I had an answer, new doubts crept in. The hardest part was the silence. Adam and I still talked, but our conversations felt guarded. I knew he was trying to move forward, but there was an invisible wall between us now, something that hadn't been there before. I couldn't tell if he resented me for speaking up, or if he was just overwhelmed by everything else going on in his life. Julia's anger, on the other hand, was anything but silent. She didn't hold back in making her feelings known. "You had no right to interfere," she told me during one of our rare conversations. "You think you helped him, but all you did was make things worse." Her words stung, not because I fully believed them, but because they echoed the fears I already had. I tried to rationalize it. I told myself that honesty was better than living in ignorance. But there were moments when I wondered if I had acted out of loyalty to Adam or out of some lingering bitterness from my brief past with Julia. Was I truly looking out for my friend, or was there a selfish motive buried somewhere deep down? The lines between right and wrong felt blurrier than ever. And yet, despite all the doubt and second-guessing, I couldn't shake the feeling that Adam deserved to know. But at what cost? Looking back on everything, I still can't decide if I did the right thing. Adam eventually told me he appreciated my honesty, but the way he said it felt more like a polite acknowledgement than genuine gratitude. Julia, meanwhile, made it clear she would never forgive me for the part I played in exposing her secret. And Chris. He moved on without a care in the world, leaving behind the wreckage he'd helped create. I can't ignore the impact of my decision. Adam and Julia's marriage has survived for now, but I know things between them will never be the same. As for my relationship with them, it's changed forever. There's a distance between us now that didn't exist before. Even when we're all in the same room, it feels like something is missing. A trust, a comfort, a shared understanding that was shattered the moment I spoke up. I thought telling the truth would bring clarity, but instead, it's left me stuck in a gray area. Was it my place to say anything? Should I have stayed out of it? Every choice I could have made had its own set of consequences, and I still don't know if I picked the right one. That's why I'm sharing this story. I've laid everything out as honestly as I can, and now I'm turning to you. Did I do the right thing by telling Adam the truth? Was I wrong for involving myself in their marriage, or was staying silent not an option once I knew what I knew? So here's the question I keep asking myself. Am I the bad guy in this story? I need your perspective because after everything that's happened, I'm not sure I trust my own anymore.